I know all the folks round these arts and parts. Can't say I know you. Leastways, not yet. But I dare say I know what you'll be wanting. Some of the crack, maybe. A wee yarn with your sup, is it? No harm in that. Come on over. Warm yourself, I'll warn you, though. If it's the old Begorra and Blarney shenanigans you're after, you'll not hear them from me. Well, as such, like, pleases you, you sit on. I'll fill your ears. And see what story is meant for you on this dark old night.
I'm Chris.
I'm Spence.
And this is the Irish Gothic podcast.
They say good things come in small packages. But this week, our package is full of bloodlust and death. And also could have been the forerunner to one of the most horrific characters in modern literature. This is the legend of Abhartach. Hello there, Spence. It's 2025.
It's great to be back, Chris. You're looking very well. The audiences just have to trust me on that.
Yeah, well, they will have to trust you, yeah. This is the show that we should have our green beers out for, because this is certainly on St. Patrick's.
Indeed. I know we've already done our St. Patrick's episode. We got so excited we released it too early.
That was a bit of bad planning on our behalf.
The excitement got the better of us. On that, I did, as promised, Christopher, get to Slemish. Well, I got to the base camp of Slemish. It was very, very slippery days, so we didn't risk going any higher up. But I would say, and anybody should check out our St. Patrick's podcast. It is a very mysterious and mythical place. It was quiet, and you could very easily see how that could be a place where legends could be given birth. It was a super atmosphere around it, man, but I didn't quite make it to the top, buddy.
Well, I mean, apparently he was a slave, and he used to walk up and down it barefoot, which is why people do that on a day like today. Now, I might walk up it, but I'm not walking up it barefoot, I can tell you that.
A little too intrepid for me, mate.
Yes. So this week, we are doing Abhartach, the legend of Ireland's earliest vampire chieftain.
And I think this is one of those stories, Chris, that we're lucky to be able to count this as one of our own legends, have our own little stake, no pun intended. I've been working on that all week, Chris.
Yeah. High stakes.
There we go. I know a little bit about it, but I'm not as familiar with it as it would be to say, Dracula and things like that. So I'll let you lead, mate.
Well, let me take you back to County Londonderry in the 5th century. Abhartach was a fearsome dwarf tyrant who ruled over an area of County Londonderry. Now, size and stature we've talked about before were much prized in ancient Ireland with our giants and so forth. They may well all talk about tall warriors and strong farmers, but Abhartach was, and Abhartach means, dwarf in Irish. Apparently. Now, that's what I'm saying. But it appears that when he was born, he was given the short end of the stick.
Okay. See, Chris, that sounds okay. A short tyrant, and it's hard to make the leap from that to vampire. But I do remember reading that he was known or considered to have kind of magical interests. He was dabbling in the arcane arts, and you start to see that creeping into his personality. And he used these things to perpetrate cruelties on his own people, not just his enemies.
Well, he certainly did, yes. He was first mentioned in a collection by Patrick Weston Joyce called The Origins and History of Irish Names and Places. So there's a place called Errigal in County Londonderry.
Yes.
And he was considered a dwarf magician and a dreadful tyrant to people. He perpetrated great cruelty on people. The legend, which was well known in Irish literary circles, sees a group of peasants in County Derry rebel against a despot. With the help of a neighbouring chieftain, Cathian, they attempt to kill Abhartach on multiple occasions. The operative word here being attempt, because they killed him numerous times and they buried him numerous times. But he rises from the grave and demands bowls of blood in compensation.
And now we're starting to see, pardon the pun again, bleeding into each other. So he demands blood sacrifice on his resurrection.
Well, he demands blood, blood to drink.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things with the first time, that sort of killing multiple times reminds me of Rasputin, the mad monk in Russia, where they apparently killed him and knifed him and poisoned him and shot him and he still wouldn't die. But they killed him and they buried him. And the next day he was up and about. So, as you say, you can already see the similarities between Abhartach and a certain Romanian prince.
Yeah. So and the similarities get even more prominent, Chris, because I think one of the ways that the peasantry killed him on at least one occasion, you'll love this, they ran him through with a sword made of yew wood and buried him upside down, surrounding his grave with thorns, and then they topped the grave with a large rock. So I'm thinking, yew wood, is that stake through the heart? Vampires buried at a crossroads. Well, this guy's buried standing up. So again, you can see those little sort of cipher fire, if you like, flying out from way, way back and into the minds of writers in the future. That definitely, there's definitely an overlap. Definitely an overlap.
Well, actually, the sword made of yew trees given to them by a local druid, because in desperation they had went to the local druid. Now, later on in versions, it becomes a Christian hermit. I would say that's after our landing of St. Patrick. But at this period, they went to a local druid to find out the proper remedy for dealing with a member of the undead. Well, as you say, they run him through, they buried him upside down, and they topped the grave with a large rock. And apparently that had the desired effect.
So was that druid like our Van Helsing?
Well, this is it. I mean, Van Helsing, of course, is the all-knowing. He's the person who destroys Dracula at the end of the book and at the end of every film. But, without him, the Dracula, he would keep on going and murdering forever. So to have a fountain of knowledge to go to is very much in the way of these tales. There always is somebody to go to. And actually, today, Spence, you can go and visit Abhartach's grave. It's locally referred to as a giant's grave, and it comprises of a large rock with two smaller rocks under a hawthorn. And it's located just north of Mackara and County Londonderry, in Furrows, Northern Ireland, where we're sitting right now.
Like, Chris, I'm going to stop you there because I know you're tempted to give exact coordinates to where this dolmen is. But we have to remember the cautionary tale, because did the druid not warn that if you disturb the rocks on the grave, his royal bloodsuckerness may well return?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because later on we'll talk about some friends of ours who made a film that very same thing did happen.
Really? Oh, wow. I know there was a documentary, man, as well. I mean, I've seen a photograph of the site, and it's, again, it's like everything else, it's striking. There was a documentary by a fella, is it Gallus? The League of Gentlemen series.
Oh, yeah.
He's a huge horror aficionado. Yes, Gallus. Mark Gallus, is it?
Yes.
And I'm sure he done a show here on the BBC and went and visited the site as well. And again, we'll get a wee link to that and stick it in the show notes. But you know what I love about it, Chris? It's like all these things in Irish Gothic. The fact that, okay, we're lucky we live in Northern Ireland, we can go and see them. But anyone visiting, these things are all there. They're still there. All these things are within touching distance, which also gives it a wee level of danger as well when you're talking about this guy.
Well, that's it. I mean, we're not going to say where they are, but anyone can find them. And they can go to most of the places. Cave of Cats was one in our last season. They can definitely go and see and experience it for themselves. Northern Ireland, and indeed Ireland, is very welcoming to people coming in. But this is where it gets interesting, I think, because this is where we talk about a certain Transylvanian prince and the striking similarities of a book that was written in the 1890s by an Irish man called Bram Stoker. Can you guess any guesses there, Spence?
I know, Chris, honestly, I'm thinking, is it Dead and Loving It?
Oh, straight on. Well, it's Bridget Jones's Diary. No, of course, it's Dracula, that masterpiece of horror. But is it as original as we may think?
There was blood. So much blood.
Well, I know, Chris, from reading, and I came to this writer's work very late, I'm embarrassed to say, but I know Sheridan Le Fanu, who in 1872, about 25 years before Stoker's Dracula, he's sort of been credited with being one of the godfathers of vampire fiction in his female vampire themed story, Carmilla. So, again, an Irishman, so did Sheridan's work influence Bram Stoker's, and did the legend that we're talking about influence both of them?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at Stoker did not get any information about vampires firsthand from Transylvania. In fact, he never even went there.
Really?
Yeah, it was never his intention to have his vampire come from Transylvania. He didn't base his original story on the historical Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Not only did Stoker know very little about Vlad, there was never any association with Vlad and vampires. Now, there was association with Vlad impaling people. There's plenty of books you can read about the original Vlad the Impaler, who impaled people on massive stakes. But there was no talk of vampirism in any way around Vlad at that point. And there was no talk of vampirism in the intervening years between his death and the writing of Dracula.
It is amazing, Chris. When we talked about Sleepy Hollow and how writers pick things from the people around them, from their childhood, from the folk stories they were told, and then suddenly new stories are born. And I remember one of the things that was referred to in relation to Dracula was when they talked about the character of Lucy. And that scene where she's on the bed and everyone's huddled around her in a real effort to save her. And one of the things that when I read up on this was that there was a memorial sculpture inside an old Irish St Patrick's Church in Monaghan, and that's known as the Parting Glance, and that showed a woman on her deathbed. People gathered round her, and the sculpture was dedicated to Mary Ann Westenra by her husband William Westenra, and that is, of course, the character name in Dracula.
We're starting to find these little golden nuggets of proof that vampires originally came from Ireland. I think we've said this before, but we know from Stoker's notes that the central character in his 1897 novel was originally going to be called Count Wampyr.
Oh, right.
So that's Wampyr. The idea to insert the name Dracula came later, after the crux of the story had been developed. In fact, Dracula wasn't even the original title of the novel.
No.
We know from his first 541-page manuscript, now owned by the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen.
What? How'd that come about?
That Stoker's original title for what would become Dracula was The Undead.
Oh, that's quite cool too, but it's hard to imagine no Dracula. How did the Microsoft guy end up with that manuscript?
Well, it was discovered in a barn in the 1980s. And I'm sure it was worth a lot of money, and the co-founder of Microsoft,
who doesn't need any money.
He doesn't need any money, no.
It would be a guy like that who finds it, wouldn't it?
He would probably bought it there, and probably for not more than it's worth, but he has the original 541-page manuscript. I mean, it must be an amazing sight to see.
But definitely see, Chris, all these overtones leading back to our Abhartach, the power, the control, the inability to stay dead, the blood sacrifice, the wooden stakes. Then you see how that all can get melded and fused with Stoker's writing to give us, my goodness, one of the most enduring horror monsters.
Just to put a final thing on the Bram Stoker Dracula and where he got his ideas from. I think we talked a little bit about this in The Headless Horseman, where we said that the writer of The Headless Horseman had spent a lot of time at Oscar Wilde's house with Oscar Wilde's wife and Oscar, and they talked about different Irish myths and legends. Well, funny enough, there was another person who often went round for tea at their house, and that might have been a Mr. Bram Stoker. So even if Bram wasn't up on his Irish myths and legends, I certainly think that those teas might have opened up a new world for him.
Oh, absolutely. Well, what a table to be gathered around now. The stories that must have been exchanged between those folks.
It definitely sounds like Wilde was a major influence on a lot of these horror writers in terms of passing on Irish stories and myths and legends. It must have been a really interesting time to sit around that table, and they were just soaking it all in.
Yeah, and we're still feeling the ripples of that now in movies. And of course, across the world, Chris, there's different versions of vampires. In India, the beetle is described as an undead creature, a bit like a bat from our vampirism stories, in that it hangs upside down on trees in cemeteries and cremation grounds. The Pishasha, the returned spirits of evildoers, or those who died insane, also can have vampire attributes. I think there's probably no end of versions of this. Now, will we ever know for sure that the one in that little field in Macara is the original?
Well, I think he is. Spence, what's your most favourite vampire film?
Ooh,
Have you got one, or does it take a couple?
do you know what? I think I have one. It's the experience of watching it as much as anything else. Salem's Lot, during my formative years, I'm sure you remember, Chris, was screened as a two-parter on the BBC. You know, a TV movie, effectively. And people of my age shouldn't have been watching it, but we all did. And that scene with the child vampire scraping the window, it really got into my DNA. It introduced me to the work of Stephen King, etc. So, purely for the impact of it, mate, that would be that. But I mean, there's so many I love. I love 30 Days a Night. I love Dracula. But Nosferatu looks like a cracking show I haven't seen yet. I've obviously seen the original. So, but I'm going to go with Salem's Lot, mate, because I think it left a real mark on me.
Well, I have an interesting fact about Nosferatu, because Nosferatu was written after Dracula. And if you know the story of Nosferatu, it is very much the story of Dracula. And Bram Stoker's wife sued the makers of Nosferatu, the original black and white film, and won. So now the Stoker estate gets money from Nosferatu.
Really? My goodness. I don't know why I would just assume, plagiarism and libel and suing as being a modern phenomenon, but there you go, people were at it back then too. So, okay. So that was basically the unofficial movie version of Stoker's Dracula.
They tried to change. It was Count Orlok, and he came to the country and he fell in love with a woman, and was very similar. The plot points overlap quite a bit.
Well, what was your favourite vampire movie be, Chris, and why?
I think there's a lot of them.
I know.
It depends. The Lost Boys, one of my favourites.
Oh, of course.
But I think it's very much a story of its time, if that makes sense. It's got the music, it's got everything else.
You mentioned an Irish film based around it.
Yes, a film by a couple of friends of ours. It was made in 2021. It was a film called The Boys from County Hell, and that depicted someone disturbing the grave of Abhartach and the big man coming back. Very good. I think it's on Shudder now, if anyone wants to have a look at it. Certainly it's a Northern Irish based film, but certainly there's no end to the vampire legend. Let the Right One In. Was it Don't Let the Right One In or Let the Right One In?
Let the Right One In, yeah. It felt so original when it came out, and that sort of kind of urban, gritty reality to it, even though the subject matter was so fantastical.
Well, this is one of the things. How many times do people try and reinvent the wheel with vampires? You go back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Blade, where the vampires sort of explode into ash and disappear. And I've always wondered what would be the consequence of you murdering a vampire and the body still being there. I mean, how do you explain that in modern day?
Yeah. That's well, it hasn't been done, has it? That's one worth doing. Put that in the old idea number cruncher.
This vampire killer is seen as a serial killer, because the bodies don't go anywhere. But I think it was easier to answer that question when they sort of exploded. There was another one that I remember, which is quite, well, I say dark, but dark was in the title. It's called Near Dark.
Yes.
Way back, and it had a couple of...
cast from Aliens.
Yes, it did. It was a film just after Aliens was made, I think.
Yeah.
It was made in 87, and I think Aliens was 86, maybe. But it had a really interesting take on vampires and how they got around during the day. But when you think about it, the rules, and we often talk about this on stuff we're developing, Spence, that the rules are very important when you're developing a character.
Yeah.
And what has happened has elements of these rules have come down through Irish mythology and probably mythology from other parts of the world, but they've all been honed down into maybe 10 things that a vampire can't have. Sunlight, stake through the heart, beheaded,
and the holy water, and
all that, and crosses.
Listen, Chris, on that, I guess we touched upon this in different forms, nearly all our episodes, funny enough, because when you talked about the original legend there, it was a druid, so it was a religious figure killed with a religious magical weapon, the U-stick. But you can see how Christianity then enters the story, because we look at how they're beaten and defeated now. It's holy water, it's the cross, it's the faith, it's the holy man. So that the iconography and the people kind of change, but the essence is the same.
Well, most definitely. I mean, I'm gonna date myself here and sort of refer back to there was a season of Doctor Who with Sylvester McCoy, and it was a bit of a mix of The Fog and a vampire film. And it was about Viking vampires. Russian invasion in England in the 1940s, and they raise up Viking vampires. But one of the scenes that interested me in that, I remember a long time watching it, was one of the Russian soldiers had to walk through the batch of vampires. And he took off his hat, his Russian hammer and sickle. And the woman said to him, "No, you need a cross." And he said, "It's not the object, it's the faith."
There you go.
That also happens, I believe, in Salem's Lot. He holds it up and he says, "No, you have to have faith." And he's able to take the cross off the preacher.
Whereas the Writer character, I think, does he not fashion a cross out of 2 sticks? Because he believes it will work. Whereas he said the Holy Mama didn't have just enough faith to face old Barlow.
Is it the play on faith that defeats these, the holding up of the cross and, the holy water that burns them because they're evil?
The purifying light of sunlight, it's almost godly and angelic in itself. I suppose every monster has to have that way of defeating it, and if the Christian belief can make that tide, it's fear and protection.
Well, who's your favourite Dracula?
I did love Christopher Lee. There was a sort of feral savageness about him.
I definitely think I was a Lee fan. I could go back to Bela, right back to Bela Lugosi, who, in another tidbit, was buried in his Dracula outfit.
Was he?
He was indeed. I mean, he was typecast, and then there was what happened to him. He was buried when he died in his Dracula outfit. I think vampires are very much part of our culture now, even though I say don't exist. I assume they don't exist. I haven't been bitten by one or seen one, but they don't exist. But they're very much part of our culture, and nobody really questions a vampire TV show or a vampire film.
And you don't have to spend, like most movies or stories, you've got to establish those rules. They've almost been absorbed into our global sort of consciousness by osmosis. New series just barely have to even touch on the rules. We just know them, whether they're real, etc. Would you then, Chris, think about going to that field in Londonderry and removing a couple of those stones, would you?
Well, I would. I think I would. I think,
would you really, though?
There might be something else down there. It's worth money, but probably oil or something like that. But it's interesting because I was looking online just before we did this, and there's a lot of people talking about vampires, real vampires in New Orleans, and not people murdering people, but people drinking blood, Like it's sort of vampire clubs, that type of thing. And that sort of Interview with the Vampire, New Orleans, that type of Anne Rice job. But there is a certain subculture where people bloodlet, for a bit of a better reason, and they will take... And I guess blood is a very important part of the whole legend, because blood is the life that keeps them going.
Yeah, yeah.
But they can never die unless specific things happen.
This is probably more humorous and scary. My wife and I, many years ago, Chris, would you like to hear this story? We were in Florida, we were sat at a bar, and there was a man sitting beside us, and he had slicked hair, very Christopher Lee / Ray Reardon for old snooker fans, and he had these headphones on, and he was staring intensely. I could see him in the mirror, so I guess that was a sign. But my wife was obsessed with this guy, and she tapped him on the shoulder. She popped the earphone out of his ear and said, "What are you listening to?" Out of the headphone came this really weird chanting. It wasn't music, it was strange chanting. He turned around and he smiled, and he had 2 filed teeth. And he said, "I'm a vampire." He put his headphone back in and stared straight ahead. And we drank up and got back to our hotel. Toot sweet, let me tell you.
I would imagine so. Do you know the reason vampires weren't seen in mirrors?
This isn't a joke, is it? No.
No.
No,
It's not a joke.
I don't know.
The reason they weren't seen in original mirrors is because mirrors were backed with silver. In modern times, we don't back mirrors with silver, I believe. So it would make sense that you could see a vampire in a mirror now.
So he could have been real then?
Who knows? He didn't jump up and rip your head off. You didn't walk into, what is it, the titty twister?
No, this was just a regular place.
And from dusk
the
till
whole way
dawn.
home, I kept thinking that scene in Lost Boys, when it could swip it in off the sea to the pier there.
What always got me about that scene in Lost Boys was you had this sort of bird noise over them. And it was like, because the interesting thing about Lost Boys was, until the end, you didn't ever see them fly. It was always the camera. It was a bit like Jaws.
Yes, it did the hard
always
work.
the camera coming in.
The camera did the hard work, yeah.
It really did that. It really did that work. I mean, we could talk all night about different types of vampires, but I think that when it really comes down to it, no matter who tries to invent or reinvent the vampire, it always comes back to the basics of sucking blood. It always comes back to very much, those basics.
Yeah.
I think in recent years, with the decline of religion, it has come away a bit from that sort of religious iconography.
Yes, I agree.
But most definitely, I think that you look at the old Hammer films, you go back as far as Dracula with Bela Lugosi, and, even as far back as Nosferatu, the film, it definitely spellbinds an audience.
100%, Chris. And maybe the last word of warning to any of our dear listeners who happen to be wandering through a wee field in Macaran, they see a couple of unusual stones under a hawthorn tree. Probably best just to leave them be, yeah?
I'd say so. So, Spence, that was the legend of Abhartach. I know we got a bit away at the end there with our love of film and television, but I most definitely think if you look into Abhartach, you're really going to believe that vampires originated in Ireland. Like every good story.
Like all good stories must. It's contractual.
It definitely is. And we've got a cracking one next week. Next week. We're going to do the history of the shillelagh.
I can't get much more Irish than that.
You cannot. But here we are on the Irish Day, the Global Irish Day, St. Patrick's Day. So happy St. Patrick's Day to all our listeners. And we will see you next week with our sticks.
Take care, folks.
Looks like your story has found you. I wish it were another. But what's meant for you won't go by you. I'm sorry. No. No, no need to look so scared, eh? Enjoy the fire. Have a sup. Sure. Isn't it all just Irish Gothic? All just Irish Gothic.
You can find us at Irish Gothic Pod on Instagram or X. Or if you want to support us, please buy us a coffee.
And look, while you're there, give us a follow to keep up with all things in the Irish Gothic podcast. Send us any Irish myths, legends, stories that you'd like us to delve into next.
The Irish Gothic podcast was brought to you by Causeway Pictures. It's hosted by Chris Patterson and Spence Wright and was produced by Rebecca Alcorn. All rights reserved. Check out our other podcast, Hostage to the Devil, which delves into the dark world of possession and exorcism. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts.